the roll.
Yes. Councilmember Rouse.
Here.
Councilmember Murillo.
Here.
And Councilmember Hotchkiss.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay. And today we're going to discuss some of the ordinances regarding State Street sidewalk behavior and panhandling. Is there a staff report or introduction?
I would refer to Mr. Colon here.
I'll give a brief introduction, Chair Rouse. You have a report that identifies the proposals that you and Councilmember Hotchkiss made in your memo several weeks ago. They fall into two categories. The first category is to relook at the existing sit-lie and abusive panhandling ordinances and see whether there are changes that are necessary because of current conditions or which have come up in your review of other cities' ordinances. The second category is to look at enacting an ordinance forbidding urinating and defecating in public. And let me take a second to talk about that one. A few years ago, the city ran into a bit of a quagmire with enforcing state law. The city had been operating under sections of the penal code that the DA would enforce as infractions that we believed forbade urinating in public. The local courts began applying a 2006 Court of Appeal ruling that said that you could only enforce those urinating in public rules as misdemeanors. And the district attorney's office, for good reason, did not want to file misdemeanors on urinating in public. That a misdemeanor, of course, includes the right to a jury trial. And I think no one felt like it was an appropriate use of resources to have jury trials for urinating in public. So we've got a bit of a workaround now using another section of state law, but it's not what I would call a secure workaround. So what we're meaning, there's a potential that this other provision of state law, which doesn't directly address urinating in public, it talks about dumping and littering, there's a potential that that section might not apply either. So what you proposed in your memo would be to add a local ordinance that directly forbids urinating and defecating. My office would prosecute that as an infraction violation, and it would be a much more direct approach to getting at that particular problem. I think that Captain Whittam is available to speak to that if you're so inclined. So those are the two categories of what you're looking at today. The other points I wanted to make are around the way in which you look at these problems. Certainly some of the behaviors that we are talking about are identified with the homeless community. But the courts have been extremely forceful in telling us that we cannot enact these laws specifically to get at the homeless population. In other words, we know that the laws have to be content neutral, meaning that they have to apply equally to anyone who is speaking in a particular way, in this case, panhandling or begging for alms. But in addition, the laws should be focused on solving what are called significant governmental interest types of problems. I've identified several of those in the staff report. They include things like public safety, visual clutter, blocking sidewalks, intimidation, avoiding intimidation of people in the streets. So all of those are good reasons, and I think the committee would do well to do a couple of things today. First, to identify the types of changes you think might be warranted. Second, to focus on the reasons for those changes. Once we have that information, we can set about, and I will set about, drafting proposed ordinance changes. The last thing I want to say is that all of these ordinance changes will need to be filtered through really a technical analysis of how much of State Street in particular we're affecting. The law requires that when you ban any kind of speech at a particular time, place, or in a particular manner, you have to leave open what the courts call ample alternative channels of communication. What that translates to is that you can't take an entire segment of town and forbid a particular class of speech. You can prohibit it in certain times, at certain areas, and in certain manners. For example, the regulations currently forbid panhandling within 25 feet of an ATM. If you picture a bubble drawn around each ATM on State Street, we know that we're only affecting a limited part of the blocks that are regulated under the ordinance. When you expand that to 80 feet, we'll have to do another analysis to make sure that we're not covering too much of State Street so as to preclude alternative avenues of communication for those who are begging for alms. So with that as an introduction, I'm happy to answer questions. As I mentioned, I know Captain Whittam is prepared to speak to the urinating and defecating issue, and I'll turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Colon. First of all, I apologize. I neglected to ask about public comment. Are there any speaker slips, Ms. Swan?
I received no speaker slips.
Okay. So, thank you. So, seeing none, we'll close public comment. And one question I did have for Mr. Colon was, when you mentioned the perimeter, the bubbles between around ATMs, has any work been done thus far as locations and mapping of that?
No, I don't think, and a couple of reasons. First, I don't think the ATMs are going to be a problem. I don't think there are enough of them to create an ample alternative channels of communication problem. One of the points discussed in the memo, though, was adding outside dining areas and perhaps movie line queues as areas around which panhandling couldn't occur. When we add those two, I think there's more of a potential to block off a substantial portion of State Street, and we'll want to look at that closely.
And in terms of definition, Mr. Colon, you mentioned not specifically targeting a group, which I think we all understand. And I believe here today that we're really talking about issues that aren't necessarily contained to one particular population, but to a range of people. So, for example, what we were talking about with our quote-unquote young urban traveler aren't necessarily the homeless population per se. They're vagabond types that are traveling through and causing many of the issues that have brought this to the forefront. So, is there any specific types of language or types of actions that we have to be cautious of as we go forward, in terms of singling out a group or calling out a particular group?
Well, yes, I think that the purposes, and this is why I suggest you also talk about the purposes of the regulations. The purposes of the regulation should be aimed at stopping legitimate public safety, visual clutter, sidewalk blockage, kinds of issues. If you, and you can be as creative as you are able in defining what those significant government interests are. The courts have been relatively respectful of local legislative judgments as to what a significant governmental interest is, but they have also seen through what I would call sham efforts to identify governmental interests where there really wasn't one. That's why it's important that the conversation really be driven by those governmental interests. Identify the problem you're trying to solve, and the law will follow.
Thank you. I was going to call Mr. Hotchkiss, since you helped draft this, to kind of lay out where we're going.
Is safety and comfortable commerce and easy access to an area such as State Street not a significant government interest?
No, I think those are significant interests.
All right. So then we can frame things in those terms. Conduct, I'd like to express, is what we're after, not populations at all. Offensive conduct, however we may define that makes it uncomfortable for families, as is rumored now, to visit Lower State Street. That's the kind of thing we are aiming to rectify, and to give the police and others the tools to do that so that people know if they cross a line, they're not to do that in Santa Barbara. Are those fair objectives?
Absolutely.
All right. I want to ask Mr. Witham, what do we do now in the case of, I guess I would call it public exposure, but we're choosing to call it urination, defecation here. Now, I mean, I don't see much of that going on, but how do we handle it now?
Councilmember Hotchkiss, right now we handle it as an infractions citation. What Mr. Colon was referring to is about 2 years ago, there was a city attorney ruling that the current, which is 374.3 of the penal code, based on a Supreme Court ruling or an appellate court ruling, prohibited us from using that section. So we used another section which was a misdemeanor. And the district attorney's office was, as Mr. Colon had stated, not inclined to prosecute that as a misdemeanor because of the jury trial issue. Since that time, there has been another ruling by the city attorney's office that has allowed us to reutilize 374.3 of the penal code, which is an infraction for urination and defecation in public. But we use it, it's not specifically defined as urination or defecation. It's more of a littering type section. So one of the things that the police department has requested the city attorney's office look at in the past is having a specifically defined municipal code ordinance to use that as one of the tools we use for enforcement of urination and defecation in
Okay,
public.
so that would be helpful to you.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. One of the things that I hear most frequently, although I have not experienced it myself, is abusive language and what you and I might call inappropriate language, particularly for young people. And I note, at least in the recent Santa Maria, not too recent, 4 years old or 5 years old approach to this, that they take on, what do they say, the use of abusive or profane language to cause fear and intimidation. Would you be comfortable with that? That's in the Ordinance 2014-03. Would you be comfortable with something like that if we incorporated it in our ordinance?
I would be. You should be aware, however, that similar language is in the existing Santa Barbara ordinance. We might want to tune that up. What the current ordinance says is that threatening either by word or gesture the person panhandled with physical harm or an assault is abusive panhandling and prohibited anywhere. Abusing the person being panhandled with words which are offensively and inherently likely to promote or provoke an immediate violent reaction. So we don't go quite as far as just using profane or other offensive language. Our ordinance currently looks at the likely reaction of the person hearing that language. And I think that was a safe direction to go at the time the ordinance was drafted. There may be room to push that envelope a little bit further into offensive language that doesn't necessarily provoke a violent response.
Yes, I see your point. I understand the reaction. But right now, at least as I'm told, people are insulted verbally and feel they can do nothing and just cringe, walk away, or whatever. For example, a friend was going into one of our restaurants downtown, and somebody came up to him and said, "You effing SOB, you can go in there, and I, the F, cannot," whatever. And he was with his family. I said, "What did you do?" And he just sort of said, "Well, we ducked." But if, in fact, people knew that that was a conduct that was offensive or it was on the books, if I can put it that way, they might be more assured in coming down and realizing that they don't just have to put up with this. At least they could, am I correct, Captain, file a complaint if they witnessed that and were willing to sign a complaint?
Certainly, if they wanted to file a report or a complaint with the police department, we would certainly take that report. In those cases, most likely what we would do is to whether that was offensive to the likeliness of provoking a violent reaction, we would forward that to the district attorneys for a filing on that.
Yeah, I'm not so interested in forwarding it to the district attorney, but I am sort of getting it on the record that people can feel they don't have to just come down and just put up with the behavior, because eventually they won't come down. That's the problem that we have now. So I'm trying to address the public confidence that they can come down and are armed with, if I can put it that way, an ordinance that at least would allow them to say, if that, what I described happened, you can't do that, and if you continue, I'm going to have you arrested. Something that gives them a proactive instead of a reactive stance. Mr. Colon, thoughts on that?
It's worth looking at.
Okay. I'll pass right now.
Ms. Murillo?
Captain Whittam, does the police department receive complaints about street people or any kind of people talking or panhandling or addressing people at ATMs? I'm trying to figure out what the culture is around ATMs. Do you get complaints from ATM users that they're harassed while they're doing their banking at the ATM?
Councilmember Murillo, regarding the specific location of ATMs and whether we receive complaints, I'm not aware that we receive that specific. It's typically that they've been assaulted or panhandled or are being harassed by an individual. And I don't recall specifically. I'd have to do research to find out whether it was specifically ATM was mentioned or not. That may not be well known among the public that there's a bubble around ATMs.
Okay, the proposal here is referring to controlling the area around ATMs. So to me, I would hope that there was some evidence that there's trouble around the ATM. And I understand the person is vulnerable. I feel vulnerable when I'm at the ATM because I'm kind of focused, on the screen, and I'm a little paranoid. I look around me because I learned that in the police academy, the Citizens Academy, to be street smart, actually. So if you come, we'll take this to the city council, I assume, to the whole council, and if you have some research or statistics about things that happen around the ATMs, I would be grateful to hear that, because that would tie controlling behavior around ATMs if we have evidence that things happen around the ATM.
Just from a law enforcement perspective, I believe that the ATM issue is important just because that's an open air area where money is received. You insert your card, you're out in the public, and money is there, so it's a prime area where somebody would want to create nuisance behavior or panhandle. So that, I believe, is the spirit behind why the ATM ordinance exists.
Okay, and if I'm understanding correctly, that was enacted in the city of Santa Barbara in 2009. And were you here? And do you remember the argument why it was 25 feet and not larger?
I don't recall. I wasn't a part of that process.
Is it fair to ask you if you support the radius being expanded to 80 feet?
I support it, yes. I mean, anything that we can do to create a bubble that would create a wider area so that deviant or that behavior wouldn't exist would be a good tool for the police department to have to enforce.
Okay. And you're saying that even though you don't have specific evidence, but you're saying that it's such a vulnerable
It's
situation.
a vulnerable open air area where large amounts of cash can flow, and it creates a prime opportunity for deviant behavior to occur. That the wider the area that we can have that, I believe it's a better tool for the police department to enforce, to create an atmosphere where that intimidation doesn't occur.
Okay. And I have a couple of other questions for you, but I am going to give you just a nice open question. What else do you think would help this situation? I like it that you're here and the other officer, because you would know how we can help this situation. So my other question about urination, and I just want to go on record, I don't think people should urinate or defecate in public. And if maybe our policy needs to be creating more public restrooms downtown, I mean, if that would help. I just remember there used to be places that advertised that they were a business on State Street, but they were also a place that was a public restroom, and I think we could do more of that. So it's not just our. Do you remember RG's Burgers had a nice sign there that said, "This is a public restroom location," and I think a lot of people used it. So
Yeah, I don't recall that.
people like to use, because my sister was the manager at Cost Plus World Market, which is another place where people like to go in there and use their bathroom. So it's not just street people that urinate in public. I would imagine our nightclub and bar patrons also. Can you confirm that?
It's a cross-section of all segments. We have the college students that come in, they get off the bus in the evenings. It's some of the bar patrons, but typically bars have restrooms inside them, so that's not as prevalent as that. Plus, we have some of the homeless, some of the young urban travelers would urinate in public, which causes not just a nuisance, but it's also a health and safety hazard. So that's why it's very important to make sure that we educate and we also enforce to prohibit the behavior. The whole idea is to change the behavior of people from doing that activity.
Okay, I just want it to be fair and look at all the cases where someone might be urinating in public. And I'm not sure if this is a question for you exactly, but what I do hear from people is street people, when you come out of a restaurant and you have leftovers, that the street people will ask you for your leftovers. That is considered panhandling, correct? I just want to get the issues out here, please. He's thinking.
Yes, it is. Any item of value being solicited is panhandling.
Okay. So I'm glad to get that out there. And I wanted to ask specifically about sit-lie in the paseos. So I read through some of the ordinance language or the municipal code that you put in here. There's a prohibition on sitting or lying. It says here, attachment 2, on a public sidewalk or public paseos between 7 a.m. and 9 p.m. So that would mean Stork Placita right here, right? And so it would mean any paseo. People cannot sit down or lie down.
The limitation is that it has to be along the first 13 blocks of State Street. So I would interpret that to mean the perpendicular intersecting paseos off of State Street.
Okay. And then back to Captain Whittam. So you obviously read through this. Are there other things that or is there anything here that you really support, or is there anything you want to add that would help with people who disturb our residents and also our visitors?
The police department's primary support is for the urination, defecation, and public ordinance. The other ones I agree with, but I think there's a need to have a specific city municipal code ordinance to address that issue. My fear is as 2 years ago, we had an appellate court ruling that took that tool away from us. And there was a time where we weren't addressing those issues because we were caught between the district attorney's office and city attorney's office and, the legal decisions that came down. So it would really resolve that issue if we had a municipal code ordinance that addressed that specific issue, because, as I said, it is a health and safety issue as well as a nuisance issue. By enforcing it, our hope is to change people's behavior just to prohibit that type of activity.
And I know we've had this discussion at the Milpas Action Task Force meetings. So it would be citywide then, this
Yes.
new idea, or not new, but a new way for the officers to prevent urinating and defecating in
Yes,
public.
and this isn't inventing the wheel, because the county has a similar ordinance that specifically addresses those issues in the county.
And just to add that the crux of the problem is on the downtown parking structures particularly, and that's where I think a lot of the calls came from for that kind of enforcement. That was probably the most abused area at the time. So I think the downtown staff, the parking staff would really like to see something happen going back the other way.
Should we encourage more law enforcement patrol in the parking structures?
That might be a solution.
Okay.
What I'd like to do is go ahead and finish, Ms. Maria, but I'd like to, once Mr. Hotchkiss has his comments, kind of go through categorically what
Okay.
we decided to come here for, so we can kind of knock them off in order.
I guess I just had one last thing. I contacted Sherry Fisher, the general manager of the MTD, our bus agency. I'm the liaison to the MTD, and she said she supported putting it into the municipal code that people could not panhandle on the buses. She said it doesn't happen often, but it does, and that the bus agency would appreciate that action. So, and then I'll look forward to going through, you're saying go through it step by step. Thank
Mr.
you.
Hotchkiss?
I won't spend long here because I think we should do the step-by-step thing. But in response or to illustrate the reason I think why ATMs are important, I think that the basic premise is that we want people who are congregated for a legitimate reason any place not to be harassed, waiting for the bus, for instance, or at an ATM, or we're going to broaden that, or maybe it's included to areas where they're dining. And that's the reason why lines for any event, such as a movie, is included. Let's move on to what you were saying. Go line by line. Mr.
I had
Rouse.
I had one more question for Mr. Colon before we went into what we've got down already, because as I looked into other agencies and certainly into other parts of the code, Mr. Colon, are there areas that can be specifically excluded, or let me reword that, included in new regulations, i.e. such as parks, something that's under the direct control of a director? Are there standards of behavior, for example, in a playground? I see Ms. Macy is here, so I'm thinking certainly of the library plaza. Are there ways to control that can be specifically contained within that area?
Yeah, the traditional and most flexible way to deal with park or public facilities is to have an ordinance that authorizes the city administrator or the director of the department to put out regulations on the use of those facilities. In my research, I did not see anything that applied to the library, nor generally to the parks. So you could also enact direct ordinances that regulated particular park or library space if you wanted to. I would suggest instead that you authorize the city administrator or director of the relevant department to issue regulations that would be enforceable criminally.
So, for example, there are issues that are probably specific to the library plaza. And if we were to direct, or if we were to authorize the director of the library to set up standards for that particular plaza within obviously legal parameters, is that something that is a possible thing to include?
Yes, the library director could create time, place, and manner regulations, the same as the city council, and the library plaza is definitely a specific place that you might want to regulate behavior in.
So could it go as far as to smoking, non-smoking,
Absolutely.
sleeping? Okay, all the above. All right, very good. That was the question I wanted to ask just before we got into our category. But Ms. Murillo, yes, please.
One more question for Mr. Kalan. So in reading through the municipal code sections, it is already prohibited, right, at bus stops, outdoor dining, and people in line? The panhandling isn't, I thought that's what I read.
Yeah, it's prohibited within an outdoor dining area. What the ordinance doesn't have is a bubble around outdoor dining areas.
Okay.
So I envision the situation where a panhandler would lean over a railing on State Street asking for donations from a patron sitting at a restaurant, and that might be a very vulnerable position for the patron to be.
Okay. And a bubble around a bus stop as well, or?
Well, I think we've got bus stops covered.
But bus stops are covered, okay.
I believe the what we also don't have is a bubble around admission queues. The ordinance, what I'm really saying is it's slightly ambiguous. It says that active panhandling is prohibited in a queue of persons waiting to gain admission. And I don't know what in the queue means. How close do you get to go before you're violating the ordinance? It might be better to have a distance regulation there.
Okay.
All right, very good. So what I would like to do then is to go through this list, if I may, maybe even doing a straw poll as we go through in the interest of time and expediency. And then perhaps if we could add to that list something very general about, I think the Library Plaza would be a very specific and good thing to talk about, since that has been a focus of a lot of attention over the last few years. If that's meets with the approval of my fellow committee members. So if we can go through the list as we have it right now, and if by acclamation we think that's a good idea, we can just move on, and otherwise we can discuss it further. So the first one was expanding the 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. hours of the current sit-lie prohibition. What was is that to those hours, or are those the hours currently?
Those are the hours currently.
And what would be the proposal, Mr. Hotchkiss?
I'm not sure. I want to ask Captain Witham, is it pushing it to 11 or 1? Does that do any good? Do we really have a problem there, or what do you think?
We have a very active downtown nightlife, especially on the weekends, so, it's,
But is panhandling involved in that?
there's panhandling at all times, especially.
So that would be till 2 o'clock then, you would say?
That would be, well, the bars typically close down at 1, they start the process at 1:30 and they close down at 2 o'clock.
So people are on the streets at 2 o'clock, so it would make sense to do it at least 2 or 2:30.
And
Wherever there's, I'm sorry.
Mr. Collin?
excuse me, Councilmember Hotchkiss.
Yeah.
This particular regulation doesn't apply to panhandling. It applies to sitting or lying down
All right, thank you.
on the sidewalks.
Right, well, then I think we should extend it, because you sometimes have problems after
But we're going to
late
have
hours.
a congregation of people, especially in the hours right before the bar is closed, where that could be an issue. So expanding that would be helpful.
What would be
Okay.
your proposal?
2 o'clock in the morning?
So 7 a.m. to 2 a.m.?
At the recommendation of the police.
Okay.
May I ask a question of Mr. Kalan on this particular issue? Reading your report, sir, it seemed that if the courts, it seems as if there's not shelter in place, there has to be shelter accommodation. And I looked at 9 o'clock, and it seemed like that would be bedtime or something like that. Do you see where I'm getting at? And I'm sorry I'm not more articulate.
No, I do see where you're getting. The city is operating under a settlement agreement arising out of a case called Ryden, where we cannot enforce our overnight camping laws unless there is unused shelter space available. So I used that as an example in the memo of a circumstance that might limit you on how late you could go on the sit-lie ordinance. I do think that as Captain Witham has described it, the influx or exit of large number of people from bars between 1:30 and 2 a.m. in the morning is definitely a good reason for wanting to have clear sidewalks at that time of night. I would want to look and see whether any cases have dealt with whether 2 a.m. to 7 a.m. is sufficient time for someone without means to get rest. And then secondarily, does that have to happen on the sidewalk? So I think that 2 a.m. is a good starting point. If there's a problem with it, I'd talk to you further when I come back with the draft ordinance.
But this is about sit-lie, not about panhandling.
Correct. And you are, what I tried to say initially, and I apologize for mixing up the issues, you are correct that we need to be cautious about the availability of shelter space before banning sleeping.
Okay. But our panhandling restrictions are enforceable after 9 p.m.
Correct.
Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so maybe it's a matter of enforcement. What,
Well, I think what I'm hearing from the police is they say they'd like this additional tool, extended time,
to stop people from
sit and lie.
sitting or lying around panhandling.
No, just sitting and lying around. It's not panhandling, we're crossing,
The current issue is sit and lie.
Yeah,
not
just sit and lie.
panhandling. So that's a separate
Once
issue.
again, I think we have to look also at the purpose. The purpose of a public sidewalk is not to camp or lie. The purpose of a public sidewalk is to go from point A to point B. And certainly, if the sidewalks are blocked or otherwise obstructed, and you have patrons coming out of a bar, what you don't want them to do, I don't think, is to detour out into the street to get around somebody. So I think it's a reasonable request, to have a restriction until that time.
Chair Rouse, I would also add that given what people are doing inside those bars at 1:30 in the morning, there's a heightened interest in public safety and making sure that someone is not down on the sidewalk due to some incapacity.
That's a very good point. Thank you.
so anyway, straw poll, I would support that. I don't know what you think, Kathy.
I think I need to sit with that one a little bit longer.
Very good.
Lie with that.
But you have, sit and lie on it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, the other one, expanding the active panhandling prohibition from the 25 feet to the 80-foot bubble, which, once again, we've already asked Captain Whittam. It's just a larger margin.
Did you skip the second one, adding a prohibition on sitting on the
Oh, I'm
planting
sorry.
railing?
I certainly did.
Sorry.
My apologies. So the prohibition of sitting, and once again, my point would be to the purpose of, if somebody's laying down upon the railing or statue or the sidewalk, are they resting? Are they coming out of the bar, as Mr. Kalon would put, and behaving otherwise? Any opinions?
Well, the purpose here is exactly what it would be on the sidewalk, so it's just sort of being a little bit more specific, so I don't have a problem with that.
Would it be appropriate to just have that combined with item 1?
No, I think they're distinct. The hours of operation are hours of sitting and lying are different from the locations. And the ordinance currently, for example, doesn't forbid lying down on a bench. You can sit or lie on a public bench all you want. The question here is whether areas adjacent to the sidewalks are appropriate for sitting or lying down, and that's where railings, plantings, and sculptures come in.
It doesn't say benches, though.
The ordinance, you mean?
Just bullet item 2 here.
No.
No, I threw that out as an example.
Oh,
It wasn't suggested in the original memo.
Okay, what's the committee's pleasure on that?
Yes, okay.
Ms. Murillo, you have an opinion?
I agree with that one.
Thank you. The third one was one I was brought up before about the ATM bubble, and that was simply the 25 to 80 feet, which is pending, of course, Mr. Kalon, the staff's research on whether or not those bubbles would overlap or intersect or not create enough of an otherwise free area to speak.
That's right. And in addition, I think the other question is whether 25 feet is a sufficient buffer. Santa Monica, for example, uses an 80-foot buffer distance. And the concern I would have is that you can travel 25 feet pretty quickly. And so I'm not sure that really gives people the comfort we're looking for when they're handling quantities of money.
Very good. Committee?
It seems to have support from our law enforcement representative and our legal advisor.
Okay. The next one was expanding the active panhandling prohibition to other areas where there are captive audiences, such as buses and other public transportation vehicles. I believe, Ms. Murillo, that's what you brought up that Ms. Fisher was talking about.
We should have Ms. Fisher or another representative of MTD come when we bring it to the full council.
Good idea. All right, very good. And then we've already gone through the prohibition of urinating and defecating in public, which I think we've got support there. And Mr. Kalon, in the recommendations on the proposal by myself and Mr. Hotchkiss. Is there anything there that is, let me just see here, different? I think the one thing I noticed right away is in the fourth item is where the requirement for appropriate signage to inform the public of these regulations. Is how, when it comes to, for example, the distance around ATM, is it either required or basically recommended to have signage informing people of that prohibition or that limitation?
It's not required. I believe that Councilmember Hotchkiss expressed an interest in increased signage to make the regulations more effective. I don't, in other words, it's not sure that people intend to be lawbreakers when they violate these regulations if they're not really known to them. But there isn't a signage requirement. And remember that with the sit-lie, I believe we have a requirement that there's a prior warning before any enforcement. So that's different than panhandling.
So would signage therefore be appropriate, fair, if I can put it that way, to let people know that there is a law in effect here and you should observe it?
It would be fair. I think you have to consider the design issues.
Right, it's got to go through HLC, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it would make it, but we could try.
Okay, and Mr. Hotchkiss just pointed out to me a couple of other recommendations that were in here. The first one was a prohibition on groups of people congregating in a manner that blocks the free movement of pedestrian traffic on our downtown sidewalks.
It seems like our municipal code already addresses that.
It does in a slightly different context, and you may wish to clarify that. It does in Chapter 9.98 with respect to exempting parade viewing, and it doesn't speak specifically to groups of people congregating. So I think it's worth investigating whether some fine-tuning of that ordinance is warranted to make it more clear.
Tim?
If I may ask?
Yes, sir.
I mean, it's natural that when a bar lets out that, you know, folks gather, maybe they're trying to figure out who's going to drive who home or whatever. And I don't think we would want to inhibit that. Is that going to be a problem for you all? Don't people gather outside a bar and then sort of disperse? Isn't that sort of a natural way to go?
It's one of the things that we require the bar owners to have security available to move those people along. And an ordinance like this would assist us in the sense that we can tell them, you know, it's illegal to gather and congregate here, please move on, rather than, you know, oh, we're just here, we're deciding something. I understand that, but could you please move along, because it is a citable offense.
Okay, I understand that, I guess.
Not that it would be utilized in an enforcement capacity often, but it is a good enforcement tool to move somebody along when they know it is enforceable.
Right, and I would like to emphasize that that's what we're doing, is providing tools here that not necessarily will be used, but are there, at least so our officers know what they can do and can't do.
And remember, officers have the finer side of discretion when
Right,
utilizing
it's a
these
matter
tools.
of discretion. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was just saying there's discretion involved in this in all capacities of enforcement, and just having the enforcement tool doesn't necessarily mean that the best way to use it is to use it as an enforcement tool, but rather as an informational, educational tool.
Thank you.
Okay. Then we talk about a prohibition on the use of public benches and street furniture for the storage, sale, or display of merchandise or personal items. Now, currently, Mr. Kalan, street vending without a permit on a public right-of-way is prohibited, is it not?
It is.
Does this, well, let me ask this. If you display, you could have a business license, but maybe that sidewalk is not your place of business. I notice in the code, you could have it in front of your storefront on an unlimited number of days out of the year. So is there a difference between the sidewalk and a bench in our current ordinance?
I believe there is. I'd defer to Captain Whittam, but my understanding from earlier discussions with the police is that displaying goods on a bench is not regulated by the current prohibition. Displaying them on the sidewalk itself would be.
But there's still the having a business license would apply in any case if the items were for sale.
Of course.
All right. Captain Whittam.
We can utilize the more generalized section of the business license, but it's always good to have a very specific tool that we use, or ordinance, to address that. And currently, I believe we can cite for venue on the sidewalk, but to have an additional just to expand that to the park benches would kind of close that gap.
Yeah, I could think of 3 specifically that are used on a daily basis for merchandise. Mr. Hotchkiss.
One of the problems that this would address is that there are some folks that like to come down and just show off their stuff, if I can put it that way, and which I understand, but they leave it there all day long, which denies the general public access to that bench for which it's intended. So if there was something that said, gee, you can't do that, you can sit on a bench, but you can't take up another bench just to show off your stuff. That's kind of what we're saying here. That may seem a bit obscure, but it does address a problem now where we have people that are not able to use a bench for somebody else's preferential activity. Make sense?
Yes, but my concern about this particular issue that we're orbiting around is that the bench, if we have controls on illegal vending, then I support that. And I know when I walk by someone and they have jewelry or some other, I know they're trying to sell them, but it also says here personal belongings. And so someone should be able to sit on a public bench with their personal belongings, separate from the issue of whether they're trying to sell something. So I'm not completely in support of that, your whole sentence there. If we can tease it out.
No, I understand.
I would appreciate
that's a good
that.
point. Like somebody has their backpack or their purse or whatever. But so address, if you will, the problem I'm talking about, where somebody's sitting on one bench and then on an adjacent bench, they've got it filled up with their stuff. And I don't mean just luggage, because that can go on the ground. But, religious objects, it can be anything. That's where I would like to say, no, that's not appropriate here. You can do that elsewhere, but not along the benches on State Street. Those are meant for shoppers and tourists.
Well, let me ask a question that may clarify this. In areas that are where for public transportation is provided, you cannot have an abandoned backpack or package or parcel. Is that true anywhere else in town? Could you put a package or a parcel down on the street and walk away from it, and there's no issue, no consequence, no regulation?
I mean, purposefully abandoning your property?
You purposely abandon your property, or, for example, if you do that at an airport, they're going to come find you, and for obvious reasons. But I just wondered if I don't know within our code if that's addressed or if that's even an issue.
Usually not. I mean, if you're going to abandon property, it would be littering. I mean, if you're going to just leave something, it would be generally defined as abandoning it in terms of littering.
Well, I know in other municipalities and other agencies there are regulations on bench timing. Now, I think that'd be an onerous thing to enforce, but certainly I would address what Mr. Hotchkiss is talking about. I don't know if that's, how much of a pervasive. Actually, we probably should ask somebody who does patrol if that's a pervasive problem downtown.
I mean, the amount of time somebody sits on a bench?
No,
and
but
regulating that?
more of the abusive storage of even personal goods, property.
On a second bench. So they're taking up 2 benches.
Or they're taking up well more than their personal space. In other words, they've got an entire bench dedicated to themselves and...
It happens often. I mean, there's
The microphone, please, Mr. Hulke.
Warren Holke, Santa Barbara Police Department. It does happen often. It is one of those things that there people will take up one of the benches in front of the coffee shops or something and sit there all day long and have backpacks and luggage and bicycles and so it's only being utilized by that one subject. Is there a tool for us now to enforce anything on that? No. That person can basically sit there as long as they want and take up the whole bench.
Well, can we, without violating their constitutional rights, tell them they need to move their stuff off of the bench?
I don't think we're talking about a speech right when you're not displaying some communicative sign or message. So I think you can regulate that. I think you can regulate the amount of time people spend on benches. although the enforcement of that would be challenging. And I would probably recommend that you include a prior warning requirement before you try to enforce that.
And if I may, I think this is a restorative policing function where there has to be a different kind of approach, which I'm really grateful that you're a part of. And I'm not comfortable coming down on people who, for whatever reason, are living on the street. And if they're not aggressive panhandling, and if they don't have a vicious dog or whatever, if they're not bothering people, I'm sorry, that's where I'm not comfortable.
I don't think we're necessarily specifically talking about people living on the street. We're talking about somebody that has an inordinate amount of goods. They may or may not be living on the street. They may just be traveling through, but they may want to be here for 2 or 3 days. They may have a hotel. I don't know. We don't know. But we're not trying to address them. We're trying to create an issue create a solution for the merchant that has somebody parked out in front of their place all in the entire day with a large amount of goods, doesn't move, doesn't allow other people to use the bench. So, you're absolutely correct in that restorative policing could deal with somebody that does have a need for services and could be talked to and could be warned that, by the way, did you know there's a 90-minute limit, whatever the limit might be, and that conversation may lead to a restorative issue.
Mr. Kalan, is there a way to make a time limit on how much time you can spend on a bench?
Yes.
Wow.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
I would go back to what we said before. There is a significant government interest in this, in making the streets free and available to all, not just to a few. So that's the rubric under which I would approach most of this. And I would think that an hour, let's say typically somebody's shopping and they want to take a rest, that an hour on a bench would be more than enough. And but that it also could prevent somebody from just occupying the bench all day long, which is kind of what we don't want to happen. We want to free those up for everybody's use.
Well, in the interest of time, I would like to maybe forward this to council with an unresolved recommendation that we have this discussion. I want to take advantage of the fact that our library director is here because I'd like to pursue that other thing. But first, we'll go to the prohibition of active panhandling within prescribed distance of the queue of persons waiting to gain admission to a place of business and outdoor areas.
Outdoor dining area.
Outdoor dining area. So before, Mr. Kalan, you talked about the potential for a quote-unquote bubble. I don't know if you have to, I imagine you have to define that in terms of spatial, like so many feet or...
Right, and 80 feet seems inordinately large in that context because you would be pushing out halfway across State Street and far beyond the ability of someone to communicate to a person seated in a dining area or in an admission line. So I think you'd be looking at a smaller distance. You could ask me to research what other jurisdictions have done, and I can do that with some technical help also from the police to look at what might be a appropriate.
I think that'd be a great idea. I don't know if the committee, if you...
Inappropriate area of bubble, that's what you're talking about?
Yeah, how big it ought to be if it's warranted.
And then with the committee's indulgence, I would like to ask Ms. Macias if you wouldn't mind coming to the dais, and I'd like to ask a couple of questions since we did touch on that. And the library plaza has been a focus of behavior to the point where council has wanted to redesign, redirect, relight, redo whatever to that place. Ms. Macias, it's my impression, at least anecdotally, that there are issues that have gone on for years in the library plaza. Could you direct, or could you tell us your opinion and your anecdotes about that?
Yes. Good afternoon. Irene Macias, Library Director. Councilmember Rouse, we have had numerous issues over the years. As you know, 2 or 3 years ago, we did hire library security, and they work very closely with the PD in enforcing existing laws and regulations. Some of the issues that we have, and I do get many complaints from the public, I think the biggest one is smoking. Smoking within, near the doorways to the library or on the property. We get a lot of complaints about inappropriate comments from people that are sitting and lying around on library grounds. Oftentimes they're insulting remarks, cursing, sometimes intimidating. We have a lot of kids in the library, and sometimes the kids have to hear this, which is, I think, the hardest thing for me. There are a number of homeless that have all their belongings with them with large shopping carts. That is mostly an aesthetic issue. But we do get complaints about that from the public. There are illegal activities that sometimes take place, but we do work closely with the police department. And, if someone's drinking or, there have been occasions where there have been drug deals, and we call the police and they deal with them.
Well, certainly those are overt illegal activities.
Right.
And I guess maybe I would ask Captain Wooden, along with yourself, given those complaints or given the list of activities.
Mr. Chair, the point of order, are we agendaized to talk about Library Plaza specifically? There's so much interest in the capital improvements around it, and I just don't see Library Plaza controls written in this report.
It's not specifically agendized, but it's a legitimate discussion under the Brown Act because you'd be directing staff to bring back information on that issue.
Right. And that's what I'm trying to get to.
You're okay with it? Thank you.
It's
Already
lawful.
cleared this with him. But my question would be is that given the list of activities that Ms. Macias is talking about, could ordinances be drafted to handle those issues categorically? And then I was going to ask Captain Whittam for his input on what might be needed to bring this entire thing to bear for the police.
Well, I think you need to exercise a lot of care. While vulgarity around children is offensive, it's probably not something you can regulate. It's probably protected speech. Certainly, storing a shopping cart on city property could be regulated. Sleeping on city property, smoking in public, outdoors can be regulated. You may have seen that Ventura is now proposing to regulate smoking in public outside. So those areas you could take a look at. What might be appropriate would be a research assignment, particularly given the agenda, a research assignment to ask me to bring back a menu of traditional public space regulations that other cities have used in similar contexts. The idea being to have a library used as a library.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Ms. Macias, how do you handle the conduct you just described now?
The conduct that isn't illegal, the library security staff do go out and talk to them. They've developed relationships with the people that are there regularly, and they often can convince them to leave the property. And sometimes they start yelling, and then we do call the PD. We have quite a regular relationship with the PD.
All right, so you're not just letting it go. You're trying to do
No.
something about it. That's great. Okay. I had one additional thing before I make a motion I want to ask about, and citing Santa Maria again. They include the areas, public areas, to be the doorways and entrances to buildings and dwellings and the grounds enclosing them, which I don't think we do right now. We require some sort of notice or ownership saying police can, clear their doorways, et cetera. Is there any way we can incorporate this? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Are you talking about sit-lie?
No, it's referring to all public areas, and I'm not sure the answer to the question you just asked me, actually.
Public property.
No, it's solicitation. I guess it should be sit-lie, too.
I can certainly look at that. I'm not familiar with, I know Santa Maria has recently enacted an ordinance just a few weeks ago, and I'm not familiar with the details of how
Okay.
they address private spaces.
All right, thank you. I'm not either. All right, so I'd like to make a motion that we forward all of these recommendations to the City Council with a proviso. They understand we had some split decisions, but generally agreement on them, and that we advise the city attorney to investigate, research, et cetera, as we have discussed. Yes.
I would prefer, if possible, to come back to the committee with a draft of regulations that would explain the reasons and purposes, and also include the data I mentioned about mapping the areas we're covering. I think that additional step of deliberation is important for the committee before this is fully baked for
Okay,
council review.
and that would be preparatory to going to the City Council once we've nailed that down.
One more ordinance committee.
All right, then that's my motion. Thank you.
Ms. Murillo.
I'll second that with the statement that our council has approved a new police officer position in the downtown corridor, and specifically to be a foot officer or bicycle officer on State Street, and to address a lot of these issues. In reading the municipal code as it is, I think we have a lot of safeguards in place. And I look forward to seeing a law enforcement of those laws and restrictions, and not that you haven't been doing it already. I know our police force works really hard in the downtown area, and I've seen recently the successes of the restorative policing department or division, and you house people, you get people into treatment, and I would like the community to recognize that our restorative policing function is successful in a very difficult arena. Other programs like the Safe Parking Program, they house people 50 every year. Those are miracles. For those of us who know, I'm in the recovery world, and I know how hard it is for people to recover from substance abuse and drug addiction and alcoholism, and all of those things play in there, I think, with most of this population. And so I think the City Council really is trying to solve the problem. Councilmember Rouse, you had the idea of the hosts. Councilmember White responded. We're trying to decide whether to go with a blue shirt or a yellow shirt, and I see those people working in Library Plaza and around the art museum. Kind of has its own population. Their people are territorial. I think we're talking about tools, but we also need personnel to use those tools, and I think the City Council is trying to make that happen.
Okay, very good. And before I ask for a vote, one clarifying statement. We're not talking about restoring or homelessness or one targeted group. We're talking about general street behavior. We have to be very, very clear about that. We're talking about everybody. We're talking about the kids in college. We're talking about adults. We're not talking about any particular group. Mr. Colon, did you have a question, sir?
No, just a suggestion that after the vote, it would be helpful to take a few minutes to talk about some of the purposes that you're trying to achieve. That would help me narrow the drafting and give me a basis for findings in the ordinance, which will be very important.
Thank you. And to that end, I was going to ask Captain Whittam one last question. When Ms. Macias asks, as there's a call for service at the Library Plaza, and are there limits on what you can do to respond to that call? In other words, some calls are not all necessarily part of the criminal code. Are there limits now that might be eased by some type of change in her ability to make that one little plaza, one little area, and the director make that specific to certain rules?
Well, certainly, and the 40 East Anapamu, which is the library, and it's the Anapamu side that has that plaza and has the issues, is an area of high calls for service for the police department due to illegal and nuisance behavior. We get calls on both. So when we respond, we have to sort that out. Is it a criminal activity? If it's a misdemeanor, it had to happen either in our presence, which usually doesn't happen for us to take any action, or we have to have a citizen's complaint signed on that. So we get there, we sort it out. If it's nuisance behavior, sometimes we will take a report on that so we can document that that occurred. But as for your question, will additional tools assist us? Yes. We will base enforcement based on what laws and ordinances are currently in place. We can't if they're not there. So if we have more strict rules and ordinances, say for things like smoking in certain locations, we can enforce those. If they're not there, we can't. So again, we're talking about regulating behavior that's undesirable, and if it's legal to do that and we have an ordinance to do that, we certainly will. But the library is an area of high calls for service for the police department.
Thank you. And with that, I'll call for a vote. We have a motion on the table. Everybody understand the motion? All those in favor? Aye. It carries unanimously. Mr. Colon.
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned, the purposes for the regulations are very important, and because the law requires us to identify significant government interests that we're accomplishing. So really just a free-flowing discussion would be helpful in informing me as I do drafting of findings to support the proposed ordinances.
All right, very good. Thank you. Yeah, we tried to cover a lot of ground today, so that definitely calls for another committee. Mr. Hotchkiss.
I go back to what I said before, I think in private communications to you and others, that our intent, at least my intent, is to make State Street a more comfortable, enjoyable environment for people of all kinds to the betterment of the commerce there and to the enjoyment of the public at large. Whereas I think regrettably now, and not entirely deservedly so, it holds a reputation for trouble. I really don't think it's like that. I think it's much better than people say, but it's going to take some time to turn that ship around. My hope is that we can that the local business people will start a campaign to say, come back to State Street, see how different it is. Already it's different because of the concerted police effort for the last 2 or 3 months, I think. And I'd like that to continue with the participation of everybody involved. And I think that my hope is that the projected ordinances will assist everyone in securing what I'm talking about here. Is that too broad, sir?
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and if there's nothing else, we are adjourned. Thank you.